Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. It was at the age of 24 that I watched my first serious anime film. That was Spirited Away, and I became so amazed, so fascinated by anime that at one point it was impossible for me to watch US animated movies. I became a huge fan of Miyazaki, Takahata, Yonebayashi, Kondo, all of the artists from Studio Ghibli, and then I explored other anime filmmakers such as Satoshi Kon, Hosoda, and one of my personal favorites, Makoto Shinkai. Now, last year I was very happy to find out that once again Miyazaki had decided to come back from retirement. And I was planning to watch The Boy and the Heron at one point anyway, but I do want to say this. It was thanks to one of my students who mentioned this movie, recommended it, and also mentioned the novel that bears the same title as the movie. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this in a few minutes, that I decided to prioritize this film and to head back to the theater after more than a year since the last time that I had been in a movie theater. Also, very importantly, this marked the first time that my girlfriend and I went to the cinema together, even though we have been dating for a while. I have no idea how that happened, but it was a very important film for us for that reason too. So I want to thank my student Jessica. I don't know if you're watching, but if you are, thank you so much for recommending this movie and for telling me about the book, because that's probably the main reason why I am doing this video. So thank you so much. So the first thing we want to do is we want to look briefly at the plot of the movie. The Boy and the Heron is the story of a 12-year-old by the name of Mahito. And he's moving to a new house with his father and his new stepmother after his mother dies while at the hospital during a fire at the time of the war, right? So many things happen at the beginning for Mahito. New house, new stepmother, new classmates, new school, everything, right? And it seems like it's overwhelming to him. But here's the interesting thing. As soon as he arrives at the new house with his stepmother, this heron comes and greets him. And then the heron continues to approach him. He knocks on his window, for example, while Mahito is in the room. It turns out that the heron can speak, right? And he tells him at one point that his mother is still alive. And so Mahito decides to follow the heron into a fantasy world. That is the premise of the movie. Speaking of genre, okay, you will remember that The Wind Rises was quite more realistic when you compared it to other movies by Miyazaki. Well, with The Boy and the Heron, we really go back to that world of unbridled fantasy that Miyazaki likes to explore. But there is a noticeable difference. I would say that The Boy and the Heron is probably the closest that Miyazaki has come so far to making a horror movie. There were dark elements, of course, in Spirited Away and in Howl's Moving Castle and in some of the other movies that Miyazaki did, but here in The Boy and the Heron, the fantasy world is quite dark, and we even see some blood and guts, believe it or not. This movie is rated PG-13, just like The Wind Rises and Princess Mononoke. So the film shares a central theme with other Miyazaki films and other Studio Ghibli films also, and that is that sometimes we experience life-altering changes and we have to do our best to adapt to them. The original title of the film is the same as the one for this beloved classic of Japanese literature for children, which is Kimitachi wa Dō Ikiru ka, and that means how do you live, right? So that is exactly what Mahito is trying to do, trying to figure out the answer to this question. How do you live, as he is trying to adapt to his new life? I was reminded, of course, of Chihiro in Spirited Away, and how she is also moving to a new home and entering a world of fantasy through a tunnel. So you have something that echoes a previous Miyazaki film right here. And of course the girls in My Neighbor Totoro are also moving to a fantasy world. So I would say this idea of moving is something that you see, a recurring theme in anime films, especially from Studio Ghibli, but others also. For example, I was reminded of Makoto Shinkai's Weathering with You. You also have a character there who has made the decision to move to a new place. And another important theme, of course, something that has been mentioned already, is the idea of the absence of the parent, right? In My Neighbor Totoro, the girl's mother was at the hospital and she was recovering from an illness. Here we have something quite different because Mahito's mother dies a horrible death at the very beginning of the film, and she is immediately replaced by another woman. Now, like the girls in My Neighbor Totoro, Mahito has a guide, in this case the Heron. But the Heron is really no Totoro, okay? He is very different. And Mahito enters this fantasy world because he hopes that that way he will be able to see his mother again. If you think about it, we come into the world through a tunnel, from the darkness into the light. And what Mahito is doing in the movie is the opposite. You could say that maybe he's retracing his steps, going through this tunnel into the dark, back into the company, hopefully, or that's what he hopes, of his mother. So I would say that the film is, among other things, a great allegory of the process of mourning. Let me tell you now a little bit about my reaction to the movie. I was in awe of the breathtaking visual quality of the film, okay? If you're a fan of Miyazaki, you know exactly what to expect when it comes to visuals and the power of these visuals, and I will say that this movie, I don't think it's going to disappoint you. The music is also great, okay, by Joe Hisaishi. He is just wonderful at capturing the wide range of emotions that the movie contains, and this is a score that's going to keep resonating with you after you have watched the movie. I also like the characters, of course, even though the Heron is not particularly a likable character, I would say. Once again, he is no Totoro, but he is not really meant to be like Totoro, and he is not the main character in the movie in any case. And the conflict itself I found to be relatable. Because this idea, the main idea that I shared with you before, this notion that, sometimes we experience life-altering changes and we have to adapt to them, that is something that we can all relate at one level or another. And then who doesn't like the idea of having the ability to move into a world of fantasy? I think that is amazing. And it goes back to so many classics of children's literature, like Alice in Wonderland, for example. You could draw a parallel between the rabbit and the heron if you want to. And remember that Alice in Wonderland is also something that Totoro has been compared to, because you have also a similar idea of going through a little tunnel into a fantasy world. Now, I have to say this, as I left the theater, I felt that there was too much going on sometimes in the movie, okay? I asked myself, for example, what was up with those parakeets and their king? What about those geometric figures that that guy was piling on top of each other? And then why did the stepmother decide to go into the forest by herself? Those were some questions that I had as I left the theater. But then on the way back home in the car, as I started talking about the film with my girlfriend, I realized that there were many answers to those questions that I hadn't considered. It was like we tried to make sense of the movie as we were going back home, and I realized that all of those things that I considered to be loose ends actually made perfect sense when you started to think about them. So I feel that this is a movie that improves upon a second viewing, so I'm looking forward to doing that. Now let me tell you some conclusions about the movie before we start talking about the novel. My favorite Miyazaki film, just to put things in context, is Howl's Moving Castle. And that is something that shocks my students sometimes. They ask me, it's not Spirited Away? No, it's not Spirited Away. It's Howl's Moving Castle. I need to explore why I have that connection with it, but maybe that's a topic for a future video. But I really, really enjoyed The Boy and the Heron without really considering it to be one of my favorites by Miyazaki. I would say that I liked it as much as I did The Wind Rises, or as much as I liked maybe When Marnie Was There by Yonebayashi. And by the way, there are many connections between When Marnie Was There and The Boy and the Heron. I don't want to go into too much detail with those because I don't want to spoil the experience for you. But if you watch The Boy and the Heron and you have watched When Marnie Was There, then you will know what I'm talking about. Now let's talk about the book, okay? So before I experienced the movie by Miyazaki, I decided to read Genzaburo Yoshino's How Do You Live, which was published in 1937. Now, the movie and the book have exactly the same title in the original Japanese, but The Boy and the Heron, this has to be said, is not an adaptation of How Do You Live. Okay, it's very important to clarify that. Now, that said, there are many connections between the two texts, okay? And most importantly, the novel does appear in the film at a very important part, and the protagonist, Mahito, of the film actually reads the novel in the movie. So that is important. It does have an important place within the movie, but it is not by any means an adaptation of the text. Now, what is How Do You Live? It's basically the story of Copper. He is in junior high school. This is a coming of age novel. Basically, Copper's father has died, and so he has his uncle as a figure who comes in order to help him to figure out life and to grow up, I guess you could say. So in the movie, the protagonist has lost his mother. Here in the novel, he has lost his father. Basically, what happens is that he has to figure out life by himself, in both cases, right? Mahito and Copper. They have the same situation right here. So the novel really has an unconventional structure because you hear about Copper's experiences, for example, in high school, his relationship with his friends and all that, but interspersed with that, we get the notebook of Copper's uncle, in which he writes down ideas that he hopes will help Copper to figure out life and to live a good life. There are many themes in this novel, but I wanted to mention a few of them just to give you an idea of the contents that you will find here. I think the most important theme to How Do You Live is think about others and not only of yourself. Copper's uncle tells him that as human beings, for obvious reasons, we have a tendency to put ourselves first and to think that the entire universe revolves around us, but it is good to transcend the ego. So that is one of the, I guess, life experiences that Copper's uncle tries to pass on to him. The other one is that we should make our best to process our experience. And what this means is basically that when we encounter something in life that we think is interesting or that moves us for some reason, Copper's uncle says, try to explore that, right? Why does that move you? Why was that something important that happened to you? Why did it touch you the way it did? So try to figure out, what things are important to you. These impressions that are left, right? That is how we come to know ourselves. Another thing that I found in the book, and this is something that my mother continues to teach me to this very day, is the concept or the notion that experience is non-transferable. Experience has no price really, because nobody can transfer their experience to you. I wanted to share with you a quote here from page 46 that is related to this idea and that I believe illustrates it very well. So this is from Copper's uncle's notebook. When it comes to English, geometry, algebra, even someone like me could teach you these. However, people come together and build this world, and they live their different lives in it individually, and I cannot teach you what that means or what value it all has. This is something that you must discover on your own as you get older. And even after that, when you are grown, you will have to study this and seek out the answers for yourself. And then another important point that I wanted to highlight is the interconnectivity of human beings. This is something that I was happy to find in this novel because actually I had thought about it by myself also. In the example that the novel gives, Copper thinks about the milk that he used to drink when he was a kid. And all of a sudden he has this illumination when he thinks of all the people who are involved in the process of bringing this milk from its source to him. So I think that was amazing. At one point I remember I was in a cafe and I had ordered a cup of tea because I drink more tea than coffee. I love coffee too, but my stomach is not very good, so I have to kind of stick to tea. And I was thinking, all of a sudden I had the same experience that Copper has in the novel. I was thinking, wow, think about this cup of tea, all that goes into it. The person who gave me the cup of tea, the people who process the sugar, the people who process the tea, the transportation for all of these things, the people who work in the fields. And when you start thinking about it, it's almost as if you could basically fit the entire universe into every little thing that we see, because there are so many connections, so many interconnections to people. So those are some important themes, but there are many others that I would like to kind of just mention to you. The novel discusses the issue of poverty. Okay, because one of Copper's friends is not as well off as the others are. And this is the main problem with our world, according to Copper's uncle. For example, on page 120, he shares an idea with us about that topic. He says, as for why this is so, please remember this well. It's because in the world today, the vast majority of people are poor. So the vast majority of the people in this world are unable to live their lives in a way that is really human. This is the problem of our time, greater than any other. So that gives you an idea of the importance that is placed on the concept of poverty and why people should not discriminate others according to their economic status. Copper's uncle also emphasizes the idea that we must be heroic. And as an example of that, we get some ideas and some thoughts about Napoleon. And of course, then friendship is exalted throughout the novel because the novel follows the experiences not only of Copper, but also of his three friends. And that is why you can see the four kids right here in the cover of the book. In the last third of the book, I thought this was interesting. Guilt becomes a very important theme. I think this is something that many people will be able to relate to, especially children. I was reminded of a recent reading that I did that I shared with you in Spanish, Herman Hesse's Damien. There's also an element of guilt right there. So I connected this text to that. Now, I thought that How Do You Live is a really was a really pleasant surprise to me. The structure is really strange. This idea that we have the experiences of Copper and then the notebook of his uncle. But as Neil Gaiman points out in the introduction, and by the way, yes, the introduction is by Neil Gaiman. That makes it interesting, right? It makes this novel interesting. And he mentions other texts that have maybe a weird structure. He gives the example of Moby Dick, right? It doesn't get any weirder than that when it comes to telling a story. So I think it really makes it a pleasant surprise in that sense too, that it's unexpected in its structure. How Do You Live, to me, was kind of a mix between two books that I have read. One of them is Usain Goddard's Sophie's World, because we get a lot of philosophical discussions. And another one was Cuore, or Heart, or Corazón in Spanish, by Edmondo de Amicis, because it is also about kids trying to grow up and trying to figure out life, about friendship. There's also quite a bit about poverty in this book. By the way, please let me know if you would like for me to talk about Cuore, because this is a beloved classic of children's literature. And actually, Cuore was quite popular, I believe, in Japan. When I was a kid, I saw an animated version of, or an adaptation of the story, and it was from Japan. It was an anime movie. So that tells you a little bit about the place that this book has in some countries. Now, this may be cultural, but as I was reading How Do You Live, I felt that there was something missing, and that is that there was not enough talk about girls. I believe that at this age, my friends and I were probably 80% of the time talking about girls. Now, as I said before, that may be totally cultural, but in any case, there are not many female characters in the novel, just so you know. We hear very, very briefly about Copper's mother, and then one of his friend's sister, Katsuko, appears rather prominently, at least at one point in the novel, but basically that is about it. For the most part, it's just the guys talking to each other. Now, I was surprised also by something that I found in this novel, and that is the fact that Copper's uncle quotes Pascal. Okay, so I was like, wow, that is quite a surprise right there. And then another connection that I made, and the quote by Pascal you can find on page 229. I was looking for that. And another interesting thing that I found was that when Copper's uncle talks about suffering and pain, I felt that he anticipates a great classic, a book that I really enjoyed reading and that helped me a lot, which is The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis. So I thought those were nice connections to find and unexpected, right? So it goes into that idea as to why this book was to me a pleasant surprise. So, bottom line, I highly recommend both The Boy and the Heron and How Do You Live. I feel that both of these, the movie and the book, are wonderful experiences. I look forward to rewatching the film because, as I said before, I feel that I need to do that in order to make the most of it and to pay closer attention to it. And then when it comes to the book, I would say that it was not exactly mind-blowing, but I was really happy to find here so many things that I had thought about myself and so many lessons that, for example, my mother taught me and that she actually continues to teach me. So many passages and so many things that resonate with me personally. If you like the movie, by the way, make sure to watch When Marnie Was There, because as I said before, there are many connections between the two. So do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. Those were my 2 cents on Hayao Miyazaki's The Boy and the Heron and Genzaburo Yoshino's How Do You Live. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by and have a wonderful day.